Hello, folks. It's your friend Bernie here. And on today's Coworking Values podcast, we're talking with my mate Martyn Sibley. And Martyn is a force of nature in the disability and accessibility conversation worldwide. He has been in a wheelchair since he was 3, but that has not stopped him traveling the world, starting companies, constantly campaigning for a more positive look at accessibility and disability, and is even LinkedIn made him a change maker on the whole subject. So he is just like a positive can of Red Bull to talk to. But we get into how co-working and accessibility needs to be more, just more articulated and more talked about. We talk a lot about, when I say we, on this podcast and in the co-working assembly, we're always talking about inclusion, diversity, accessibility, and equity. And the one that kind of rolls off the table a bit is accessibility. And Janine is red hot on this, but I definitely can do more. So in 2024, we'll be talking about this much, much more and working out how to connect the co-working universe in a much more positive way with the accessibility conversation. Martyn co-founded a agency called Purple Goat, which connects brands and educates brands how to, tap into the $8 trillion global disability market. So it's not a small thing. I've really enjoyed this podcast. This is one of a new series we're starting with David from Nook about accessibility, neurodiversity, and remote work. And we'll be kicking that off at the end of this year. Really hope you enjoy the show. Be careful out there. It is a jungle. Hello, folks, and welcome to another Co-working Values podcast. I am wildly excited today because the legend that is Martyn Selby is on the line with me. So, Martyn, what are you known for, sir, and what would you like to be known for?
Great question. Firstly, thanks for having me on the show, and I'm glad we get to hang out and catch up in general because it's something we've been trying to do for a while now. And my career has definitely been around disability inclusion, but very much with social media and business as a kind of focus and a driver of inclusion. And what I'd like to be known for would be helping to create a truly accessible world.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. How many countries have you visited, Martyn?
I don't have an exact number, but I'm going to go around 25.
That's because I was looking at your website a few weeks ago and I noticed how you got stuck in Mexico when the Icelandic thing happened, and I got stuck in Argentina at the same time, and I felt that you looked like really cheery about like, oh no, we're stuck in Mexico. Well, we better be able to hack it out. So because you started that business about accessible travel, and how I think I want to say like how easy was it to find places that were like truly accessible to disabled travelers? Because that seems like a really, when you say it seems like a really, oh yeah, that makes sense. But how hard is it to find people that are actually, do what they say when they say we welcome people in like this?
Yeah, so I guess one framing of prior to the business that was called Accomable is I'm, for people that listen that haven't come across me, I'm in a wheelchair, so my disability, speaks.
That would make it all make much more sense.
So I've got a neuromuscular disability. I'm in a wheelchair. I have sort of care support. So physically, I'm very weak, and there's not a lot I can do for myself physically. But then sort of cognitively, I went to mainstream school. I got a degree in economics and a master's in marketing. So then when I started working originally at a disability charity, I found blogging and social media. This is like 2009. And from that, various projects kind of came out of it, and I went freelance. And then I started a magazine with a good friend of mine called Disability Horizons. And so through publishing content by lots of other disabled people, we focused in on travel, relationships, and sort of sport, leisure. So it was a very much a lifestyle magazine. And so through my personal experience in terms of the travel question, it's always been very logistically challenging to go on a plane, to find accessible accommodation, to get around a new city when you're not sure if and where there is wheelchair access. Obviously, for other parts of the disabled community, they might have to factor in, neurodiversity or deaf and hard of hearing or blind and visually impaired. So I always obviously speak most confidently to the wheelchair user stuff, but then through my career, I've, worked with lots of other people, and I have a lot of empathy and understanding of those other segments. And yeah, so essentially, when it's a logistical, physical environment question, that's, there are just parts of the world that just don't have drop curbs or, ramps or lifts in the building. And so those places are very, very difficult, if not impossible, for someone like myself in a wheelchair. And then there's another layer beyond that kind of physical environment part, which is around sort of attitudes and information. So, if sometimes I've gone places where it's not particularly accessible, but the people have just been amazing at helping to just find solutions. So you might call it customer service, but really it's like culture and just humanity, that people are just willing to roll up the sleeves and just help find answers, even if they're a little bit out of the box. But kind of similar but separate to the attitude side is information. So again, looking for, if a place is accessible, logistically or environmentally, having clear information, even with photos and videos that show if a place is accessible or not, is really, really helpful. And so when we started Accomable off the back of the magazine circa 2016, there just wasn't really any of this kind of information provision and this awareness and education in the tourism field. And so essentially we were able to try and drive change, where by saying, if you actually get your house in order and you have, trained staff that are confident around disability, there's this huge business case that most people aren't aware of. And just to put some numbers on that, there's about 1.3 billion people in the world that are classed as disabled under sort of United Nations metrics and government metrics, etc. And that equates to about an $8 trillion spending power in terms of overall market. So I've not got the global tourism stat off the top of my head now, but you get the gist that it's actually a hugely untapped market. So people have started to go, oh, actually, if we make our hotel accessible and we have staff that are confident around disabled people, we're actually going to help the bottom line. And that's what's really moved people. Whereas historically, the kind of activist, charity model, political model was all very relevant and very needed for the community, but it didn't really get businesses making changes and almost investing in those changes, because they didn't understand that they could make more profit out the back end of that as well.
So in the UK, what percentage or how many millions of people in the UK are classed as disabled?
Yeah, the UK stats is about 14 million, which is around 20% of the population. Obviously, to the prior caveat, a lot of people think disability is wheelchair user, whereas wheelchair users in the UK, like myself, is about 1.2 million. So even there, like 1.2 million people is a huge market. So it definitely should be catered for. But then, yeah, you've also got in that 14 million those other segments that I briefly touched upon before.
So I always feel that, and just from when I was at uni about 100 years ago, I worked on this project where we took disabled adults mentally and physically on a holiday, and I kind of knew a bit what I was doing, but when I was actually traveling around another city, I got an insight into, you have to plan it all out, and then when you become when I was a parent and I had to take a pushchair around, it was the same thing. It's like you can just wander up and down this road all day and not think about it. But then when you have to think about, like you said, drop curbs, and has this station got, I need to get off at this station because it's got a lift and it's easy to get on the bus. And, there's this whole other, process that you have to put in place just to go out and get a cup of coffee. And I always feel that from that little insight I have and the, small amount of time I've spent in those situations, is sometimes it's easier just not to go out, like I won't I won't go to that space because they say they do this, but they might have step 1 and 2 in place. But then when I get into, step 3, it will be, a half-assed, affair. And is that what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I've had trips. You reference how many countries I've been to. I've done a lot of traveling. I wrote, I like to say the word memoir because it just sounds exotic, but I've written a book on those travel adventures called Everything is Possible. And, in there, it's kind of, we can go into the negative and the places that are just bad and not accessible and the people that are just rude and ignorant about disability. And yeah, like there's definitely too much of that still happening in 2023. But as you know, Bernie, I'm very much a positive optimist, and I like to also look at what has improved and what is good. And so there are times that I, probably now more than say 20 years ago, like when I'm going from Cambridgeshire where I live to London, where we've sort of got our offices based and have meetings for my job at the moment, that I can now more easily get on a train with the ramp assistance and get around the tube, where as long as I know which tube stations are accessible or not, and do that little bit of prep. Speaking to your point, there definitely is still a need for prep, but the more I've done it and the more confident I've got, there's definitely a lot more journeys and a lot more destinations where you can go and have a great time and do all the things you want to do. So I think it's a balance about highlighting what is still not where it should be, but then not let that put disabled people off bothering trying in the first place, and also not giving an excuse to businesses to almost say, well, we're not going to, change because people aren't actually wanting and trying to come to us anyway. So it's a bit of a two pedals on a bicycle. It's sort of changing what needs to be better, but also highlighting the positive and the good so that businesses and disabled people are more kind of confidently going out and, benefiting one way or another.
So if I'm running a co-working space and I have, and as I'm saying this, I can think of places that do have all this in place. What could I put on my website? So, if I run Acme co-working space in central London, what could I put on my website that would make you go, okay, that was a no-brainer. I'm going to go there.
So when I was right in the thick of the tourism industry, and I'm still sort of dipping my toe in, but obviously, I'm running the marketing agency. I'm just referencing this in terms of it was probably 3-4 years ago that something called an access statement was really the thing that was being pushed. And I don't see that will have changed in the last 2 to 3 years. And essentially that, people can Google or whatever search engine you want to use the access statement and learn a bit more about that. But essentially the access statement is just a way of breaking down what is accessible. But I think the point as well is to own what isn't where it could be. So if there is a co-working space and it has 2 steps to get in and there isn't another door and there isn't a portable ramp, there's obviously a question, well, could there be a portable ramp? How could we make this accessible to someone, for example, in a wheelchair? But ultimately, fundamentally, if it isn't accessible to certain groups of people, it's better to own that. So I don't basically, like to your point earlier, turn up and then go, oh, I've just wasted this whole journey because they've sort of blagged that they're accessible because they're probably scared of getting in trouble. But I'm now more annoyed and more angry and more upset that I've done this journey and I can't actually get in the place. So yeah, it's looking at the physical environment. It's sharing things like, have staff been, trained on disability awareness or whatever might feel relevant. But ultimately, it's just being as accessible as you can be, but articulating how accessible you are through this access statement. But I'd even go a step above that and say, if people literally don't have a clue what to do for access, like let alone draft the access statement and put it on the website, but they're literally just starting at the first point, it's to actually speak to disabled people and learn from the community what makes something good or not so good, and how there are quite cheap and easy solutions that they probably not even thought of. So I think that dialogue and communication with the community is really step one. But then, yeah, like owning that and then communicating that through the website, through social media, so that people doing their research can almost make the decision for themselves if that co-working place is generally the right place for them, but including the access part that people like myself have to consider.
So with something I see a lot around on the tube nowadays is it says things like not all disabilities are visible. And can you say a bit about that? Because I was like delighted to see that, because like I'm dyslexic and a bit ADHD, and I've it's taken me like 15 years to make coping mechanisms, and it works. But I remember when I wasn't aware of my differences, if you like, it was harder than I thought it would be, and I couldn't understand. And I'm very tiny bit on a scale compared with a lot of people, but how can we be aware of that? Or like that makes really good sense, because I've worked with in restaurants and co-working spaces where they've tried to do everything on the off chance that someone will come in with a knee disability that requires a specific type of air freshener and plants, and they try to accommodate everybody. And they've just it's just not realistic. And then, they kind of needed permission to say, like, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do the best we can here. And I think that's my personal experience of hospitality and co-working, that works really good. Can you say a little bit, just before we came on, you were saying about how you tried to find a co-working space and working, in your local area, and how that went and what could have been better?
Yeah, so when I worked and lived in London for 5 years, I worked for a charity in employment, and that I had an office there. And then I left in 2011 to sort of go off and figure out all this other stuff. And there was a little period in London where I was working out of cafes, but around 2011, I think you probably have more knowledge of the history of co-working than I, but it was certainly in an infancy, and I was content, just going down to a cafe in Stoke Newington. But as the sort of decade passed and I was still doing a lot of, solopreneur, freelancer kind of work, I really was craving a space to go to not always be in the house, and B, to actually just get to meet other people a bit more, whether that was going to be beneficial networking for actual work, but also just, human interaction and the social benefits as well. So I'm living in St Ives in Cambridgeshire. So both St Ives itself had a couple of essentially co-working places that I'd found, but were just not accessible at all. They literally were up a flight of stairs, and there was no lift, and there was no way they could change that. There's a thing under the Equalities Act, which is reasonable adjustment. So if there's like a huge multinational business and they've, got steps, reasonable adjustment would be they could put a lift in there or other kind of things. But for a tiny little SME running a local small town co-working, if the law enforced them to put in a lift, they would obviously go bankrupt. Therefore, it's not a reasonable adjustment. So just a little bit around the Equalities Act and what reasonable adjustment means. So they weren't doing anything wrong, but fundamentally I couldn't go and use those two co-working centres because of the building. And then likewise in Cambridge, where I thought, okay, I'm happy to go once or twice a week, a bit further away, but yeah, ultimately it'd be great to have that co-working community. Again, there was quite a few that just had steps and different things that made it not accessible. And then I would also speak to I'm not only looking at all this stuff for disability or accessibility, and there was one or two in Cambridge that had the access, but I just didn't feel the vibes in terms of my kind of people and my values and my culture. And I think that's just important to mention, that it's not only about ramps or steps, it's still that I've got those other parts of my identity when I'm going and looking as a customer for something. But yeah, ultimately this was before the pandemic, but I literally couldn't find a co-working space that was for me. And then the pandemic started and we had the lockdowns, and then I've started this new company and I partnered with a a marketing agency that have these big offices in London. So now I tend to go once a week or once a fortnight to the offices that we use at Purple Goat, and spend time with the team that I've built out. We're employing about 20 people now, so that co-working bit's been less priority the last year, but I can see a point way in the future where that is going to become something I look for again, though.
Well, just so two more things I want to ask you. One's about Citizens and John Alexander, but before we get to that, what is Purple Goat? The supernova that is Purple Goat.
Yeah, so it's in many ways it's a marketing agency. So the clients we have, and they are real global brands we're working with now, they're working with us the way they would work with your WPPs and all the big agencies that have done marketing forever. But then we're also specifically focused on disabled consumers. So we're helping brands to both become more inclusive for disabled consumers. So there's a insight, training, consulting element when they're not quite sure where to start and what to do. But ultimately, it's about content and amplification. And, instead of doing TV or radio ads, we work with influencers and social media, just because that's become a more effective return on ad spend way of brands spending their money. So yeah, we're a disability marketing agency, and we help big brands connect with disabled consumers, and that benefits disabled people, which has always been my career mission. But it also does mean that those brands benefit as a business as well.
Do you think that agency would have been possible 10 years ago, or are people just more aware than ever of this?
I think it wouldn't, for both the reasons that disability the last 10 years has become a bit more of a business case conversation, whereas prior to 10 years ago, it was still a bit more political and charity model. So that's been a big shift that made it possible. But I think definitely the guys I partnered with, called the GOAT Agency, they pioneered the use of influencers within marketing and worked out how to get really good return on ad spend. So 10 years ago, that didn't exist either. So if you didn't have the influencer social media bit, you still could have gone in on the magazine, TV, radio part of advertising, but that's kind of like one creative to many. Whereas the benefit with influencers is you can go with niche content to niche audiences at scale. So we can get really granular in the sort of segments that we're talking to by working with disabled influencers. So yeah, it wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. I know what I mean. Is it frustrating, or is it inspirational that people are paying attention now? There's a kind of business commercial value on it. Is it like, oh my God, now it's going to make money, you're paying attention, or is that actually a good thing? I mean, I've been through a personal journey. So it's a bit of a cliche to say, but for me, there's so many times I could have been very angry and bitter that personally I couldn't do things, that government didn't support disabled people in better ways, and to your question, that businesses didn't. But the journey's taken me to the point that to just get victim-y feeling and angry and bitter doesn't help me, because I don't want to live my life in that state, but it actually doesn't help move things forward. And so I'm more happy that they're doing it sort of better late than never. And because of that, there's a lot more opportunity right now to actually get involved and move the dial and achieve the things that could have, should have happened 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. So of course there's a frustration it didn't happen sooner, but actually it's more positivity that it is happening.
That's good. I'm going to, so my last thing is, I'm going to put a link to the podcast you did with everyone's new favorite person, John Alexander. And that, I think there's, can you say like your reaction to Citizens, and then something about which is the bit that really hooks me, and I think it hooks you too, is the move from the consumer story to the citizen story, and how that relates to Martyn's universe and view of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the big thing for me with John and his book and his general philosophy around citizens is it's the language it's giving people. We've all felt certain things in everyday life as individuals, as humans, when we bump up against government or business or media, those legal, those big institutions. There's always been a sort of sense that it could be so much better for more everyday people. But we never quite had the framework and the wording and the language. And I think that's what really resonated was, John comes from a marketing agency background as well. So there's definitely been a lot of crossovers in how he thinks and talks and approaches these sort of topics. But yeah, I guess in the end, for me, it's just been that we've always said disabled people should be part of the conversation and part of the solution, not the recipient of what others that have no idea what to be disabled means or is kind of saying this is the solution. And so, yeah, when you sort of look at, whether it is government policy or brand and businesses, having disabled people's voice as part of it, which is more the citizen model rather than that reactive consumer bit, has definitely been a big, positive. Obviously, I'm very mindful that, Purple Goat, we're still getting in the door with businesses by speaking to disabled consumers, which could feel or sound contradictory. But I think for me, it's that we've got to speak the language of brand marketing and of agencies that we also work through. We have to be able to speak to that consumer narrative because that is still very prevalent in the bigger picture. But again, it's then helping them move more towards the citizen model. And that's what we're doing in our niche within disability.
When if I was to come to you and say like, oh, Martyn, I want to start a business, when would you say is brand, what stage, trying to like make a question that is you're able to answer, able to understand, sorry. If I came to you, what point would you tell me I need to start worrying about brand? Because that brand thing gets
I think
thrown
partly
around
I use the word
and I'm
brand
never
a
really
lot
sure
in the context of Purple Goat and the people, the sort of target audience of our ideal client,
how people understand
our inverted commas brand. So for me, it has that more specific way of saying there's these large existing businesses and they are brands as a synonymous word as they are businesses. So for me, the word is more framed in that kind of Purple Goat marketing agency working with inverted commas brands. To your question, where it's like if someone comes and wants to start a business, I think there's a lot more around, which is what those inverted commas brands have done way back when they began. But essentially the first question is all about, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What audience, what segment are you trying to help make the world better for? What is your product or service that's going to make a difference and make positive impact? So that for me is all the first part of starting businesses and creating products and services. But yeah, in the end, the two meet in the middle where, a business is very intangible. There's like a name and the kind of the product or the service. And generally the brand is the values and what it stands for and what it wants to achieve within the world and for the world. And so I suppose in the context of someone starting something new, the brand is synonymous with the values and the difference it wants to make in the world. And the reason that happens is that, people might come and go at businesses, the physical space might change over time, but it's the brand and the values that's the forever consistent part of the business when a lot of the rest of it is very changing and quite intangible often.
That was like a textbook answer, Martyn. Where I've got to go now. Sorry, I'm just in awe of all of that. We will be back for more. Where can people connect with you, find you online, read your newsletter, and all those type of things?
Yeah, so I'm still blogging when I get a chance on martynsibley.com, Martyn with a Y. And that's sort of where a lot of the kind of updates of my world and life go. And then I'm on all social media platforms as Martyn Sibley. And then if people are interested in Purple Goat specifically, we've got a lot on particularly LinkedIn, where we update on the agency progress and some of the things we're doing. So yeah, you can check out Purple Goat Agency as well.
That's great. I can't remember when I wasn't following you online, Martyn, and I really enjoyed the journey, the progression, the stunts, and just the ultra genuine positive vibe that you bring into the online world. So thank you very much.
Oh, likewise, mate. All you're doing with podcasting and co-working, and your move to Spain has been very inspirational for me. And hopefully we can do an in-person in Spain at some point.
Yeah, there's in Vigo. It's a very hilly city, and I am astounded at the amount of people with walking sticks and crutches and wheelchairs that just whiz around here. It's like they don't even notice, and it's not like the whole town's been specifically built. There's it's very inspirational. If that doesn't sound weird. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you go to coworkingassembly.eu or Google London Coworking Assembly, you will find this podcast there. And if you could, wherever you listen to your podcast, start rating it. We've been really bad at asking people to do this, but when you rate a podcast in whichever app you listen to, it really, really helps more than you will ever know. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and be careful out there. It is a jungle.